Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to take a little time here to take you on a journey of some seabird research and some highly collaborative work among different organizations, different countries, and just it really fits in, I think, with that whole theme of just collaborative work and being entwined in trying to answer questions that are not easy to answer or not even possible to answer on your own. A little bit of background. I was born in Seattle, Washington. This picture is a picture of my grandfather in a wooden seiner crossing the Gulf of Alaska. My dad's family were all fishermen from Anacortes, Washington. And so when we spent plenty of time near the ocean. But my dad, after graduating college, decided to move on to business. So when I was pretty young, we ended up moving to San Francisco Bay Area. Luckily, down in that region, my mom's brother was also a commercial fisherman. He had this salmon trawler out of Monterey Bay. He also fished up in Alaska with my grandfather. On my dad's side, on the boat there, the Anita. So I really developed a love of the ocean and wooden boats early in my career. And so after graduating high school, there was two things I wanted to do. One, I was interested in studying wildlife, but I was a little too shy and self-conscious to really think about going to a university. I wasn't sure if I could actually do that. But I wanted to get out of the suburbs of San Francisco, that was for sure. So I went to Feather River Community College up in the mountains, the Sierra Mountains of California, which was known for having one stoplight in the entire county, not just the town. So I thought that's a good place for me to go. After a year there, I thought, oh yeah, I think I can do this college thing. So I moved on to Humboldt State University. And I met this amazing girl there, which you've already heard about that story. You know how that went. And after that, at Humboldt State, we worked on a wide variety of seasonal jobs. I worked on studies of fish, elk, vegetation sampling, all kinds of projects. And then decided, with Kim, we decided to go to Moss Landing Marine Labs and focus on marine studies. And at that point, I started studying harbor seals. But there was a little bit of an intermission there that Willa referred to. My love of boats, I knew I couldn't build a fishing boat or take off fishing. I was kind of focused on my science career. So I built a wooden kayak. And we planned a trip, Kim and I, with a couple friends, to spend 2.5 months paddling in Southeast Alaska. So we took a little bit of an intermission during our master's projects. And interesting enough, that's a picture of Kim and I and our friends who had landed. We finished up our trip. We started in Wrangell, finished up our trip in Juneau after traveling all over northern Southeast Alaska. And little did we know we'd lived there eventually. This is Fisherman's Bend in Auke Bay, and that's where we now have our little fishing boat too. And it just so happened that on our way back on that trip, on the ferry, this was in 1993, we were coming into Sitka, and I looked behind the ferry. We were, of course, watching for seabirds and marine mammals, and I see this wooden seiner called the Anita with a black hull. I go, that boat didn't have a black hull, but that looks like the boat my grandfather used to fish. And indeed it was. I went down to the harbor and found that boat and talked to the person who was running it at the time, and he remembered my grandfather. So that was a really neat connection. Okay, back to Moss Landing, finish up our master's thesis. And then I was fortunate enough to get a job in Alaska working on seabirds, and got a position with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It was funded by the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council, and was one of the post-Exxon Valdez oil spill studies looking at why are seabirds slow to recover from the oil spill, and then also put that into perspective of some long-term declines. And this really was my first introduction into integrated ecosystem studies, and it just got me hooked on these large collaborative studies. So I decided I was going to stay within research and go back to get my PhD. So we moved down to Newport, Oregon at the Hatfield Marine Science Center. I started my PhD program there, working on seabirds, including short-tailed albatrosses, which I'll talk a little bit about. But then after getting my degree, I stayed on as a faculty member there and started the Seabird Oceanography Lab, which I'm happy to say still continues today. A postdoc who was in that program that I brought in late, she was just doing such an amazing job. And we had an opportunity to move back to Alaska, and it took a couple years, but I transitioned the lab over to her. And so she's running that lab now. And now I work for NOAA's Auke Bay Lab, where I'm involved in a variety of integrated ecosystem studies, and a new one that we're just starting up in the northern Bering Sea to look at the loss of sea ice and the effects on groundfish and crab up in the north. Okay, back to seabirds. The perception paradox. So seabirds can be extremely abundant behind fishing vessels. This is a flock of shearwaters and gulls and fulmars behind some some pollock trawlers up in the Bering Sea. So they're numerous. It's not that common that you catch a bird, but the cumulative impacts can be pretty significant. And this is a global issue. It's not unique to Alaska. In fact, it's relatively minor in Alaska compared to some of these other areas. Like, for example, here's some examples from around the world. In the Falkland Islands, those are all albatrosses. They're not gulls. Those are all albatrosses behind a trawler out near the Falkland Islands. And then down in the lower right, you can see some pelicans in a purse seine fishery near down in Chile. So it's a global problem, and in a lot of areas, it's even more difficult to manage because there's international fisheries, and the regional fisheries management organizations cover an enormous swath of water and very political in some cases. But overall, there's like roughly 600,000 birds that are killed annually in fisheries. And those are mostly showing hook and line fisheries, but they also occur in trawl fisheries, although less so, at least for albatrosses. Okay, so why is this so significant for seabirds? One thing to keep in mind is that seabirds are very much more similar to marine mammals in terms of their life history. So Wisdom is a famous lace-end albatross on Midway Island at the atoll there. And so Wisdom's the oldest known wild bird. She's at least 73 years old because she was an adult when she was banded. So they're long-lived. They're slow to reproduce. The albatrosses lay only one egg per year. They're not always successful raising that chick. They mate for life, and there's biparental care between the two. Wisdom probably raised over 35 chicks. But sometimes they take a sabbatical year, sometimes they're not successful, and she's traveled well over 3 million miles. Short-tailed albatrosses, unlike blackfoots and lace-ends, you can't really tell what age they are. To some extent, you can with short-tailed albatrosses, at least until they're 8 years old or more. So this is 5 short-tailed albatrosses on Torishima, the main breeding island in Japan. You see a little 1-month-old chick there. The ones in the background are some subadults, 4 to 6 years old, although some of them can start breeding, especially females younger in that 4 to 6 year range. But the ones that are all white are at least 8 years old or probably 10 years old or more. Short-tailed albatrosses, along with albatrosses globally, were hunted commercially for the feather trade, for oil, for fat, for fertilizer, et cetera. And short-tailed albatrosses were once the most numerous albatross in the North Pacific. There was at least 1 million. There might have been several million. And on Torishima, one of the last breeding strongholds for this species, and I should mention that all short-tailed albatrosses bred in the Western Pacific, so Hawaiian Islands, around China, Taiwan, that area. There were some potential, or what people thought potentially were breeding birds in the Aleutian Islands, but actually looking through the middens, it appears that all those individuals were small, small birds, not chicks, but maybe less than a year old. And you'll see some of the tracking data. Those birds, once they fled from the islands out west, they fly pretty quickly up to Alaska. And also that's a good reminder that short-tailed albatrosses and all albatrosses were very important in the diet of native communities throughout the Pacific Rim. They were very much a coastal species and one of the most abundant birds in middens throughout the North Pacific. But by 1949, Steller did circumnavigation of, Oliver Austin did a circumnavigation about of the breeding islands and did not see any sign of short-tailed albatrosses, known as Steller's albatrosses in some areas. So he declared them likely extinct unless there's birds wandering out away from the breeding colonies. And in fact, there were. So that life history of delayed maturation and not beginning breeding, there were, we don't know how many, probably less than 100, but nobody really knows for sure. Short-tailed albatrosses are out wandering the North Pacific that eventually came back to Torishima and began breeding. Okay, so albatrosses are opportunistic foragers. They feed on whatever food they can get, alive or dead, on the surface of the ocean, and they travel long distances. And so not all of them, but some follow fishing boats. And actually, studies have shown that there's actually certain individual birds that follow fishing boats. Not all of them do. But that's just an opportunity for them to get food scraps. But the first reported take of a short-tailed albatross was in 1995 here in Alaska. And it was reported by the fishing industry. And that's an important part of this whole story. Another one was taken in 98. And at the time, short-tailed albatrosses actually weren't even listed as endangered species within the US. They were enlisted as international endangered species. Okay, so this part of the story starts with, at the time, the North Pacific Longline Association Director Thorne Smith. It's now the Freezer Longline Coalition, but Thorne went to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and said, yeah, we caught one of these birds. What do we do about it? And he said, how can I help? So Thorne went to Senator Ted Stevens' office and he said, we need money to help solve this problem. And so they were able to shake some money loose. That money went to to Fish and Wildlife Service, to NOAA, who then distributed it to Washington Sea Grant, and to myself when I was at Oregon State University to help solve this problem. Ed Melvin with Sea Grant and Kim Dietrich in particular, they focused on the bycatch aspects of this conservation problem, and to help the fishery to make sure that they can keep fishing and find some solutions. So they developed a collaborative work with the North Pacific Longline Association, Fishing Vessel Owners Association, to start coming up with solutions for seabird bycatch in Alaska, with their primary goal is to reduce seabird bycatch without significantly increasing bycatch of another species or reducing the target catch. Okay, so there's lots of different methods to try to keep birds off the hook. And I'm focusing on longline fisheries in this particular case because that's where the major concern was for Alaska. So you can get those hooks as they're being deployed over the back of the boat or the side of the boat, depending on what type of fishery you have. The birds are attacking the baits. That's not good for the birds. It's also not good for the fishermen because then they lose bait off their hooks. And a lot of times the birds are successful getting the baits without getting hooked. Okay, so you can set those hooks underwater, like through a chute, weight the lines to get it to sink real fast, change vessel speed to get those hooks underwater faster. You can try surface scaring devices of trying to keep the birds away, which streamer lines, towing buoys, boards, using acoustic deterrents, similar to what Kim has mentioned. Also, they were tried some water cannons, spraying birds, and hoses. And then you can also just do changes in the overlap of the fishery and the birds, the temporal. Like in some areas, like down in Antarctic region, polar region down there, the breeding colonies, they've actually closed off certain areas to fishing during the breeding season. But albatrosses are in Alaska year round, so that's not an option. And then also day versus night setting. Okay, this is making the solution look easy. It wasn't. They worked for a couple of years to come up with a solution that worked best for the fishery up here. And what they came up with was paired streamer lines that were towed on either side of the, off the stern, on either side of the ground line as it's going down. And the idea is to keep bird access to those baited hooks until they're at least 2 meters below the surface of the water. Another theme you're going to see here is there's not, and I think you've seen from all the presentations so far, is that there's not one solution for everything. And that's certainly true for in this with Seabird Bycatch. Okay, so this is what the paired streamers look like. And this shows a good example of how they push the birds back behind. You can see the prop wash there. And if there's some fishermen or marine boat people in the audience, you realize, yeah, this is kind of a cheating picture because this is a trawler, not a longliner. You can see the warps and the nets on cable there, but this illustrates really well how well they work, and also that they were tried on trawlers also. Okay, so with the longline fisheries, with the work with Ed Melvin and collaborations within the fishing industry, they were able to reduce Seabird bycatch remarkably. Okay, so a fish catch was not affected. That was number one. Don't affect catch of the fish. So it actually was either the same with sablefish or it actually increased because there's more baited hooks getting down to the bottom of the ocean. And so sablefish bycatch was, Seabird bycatch, sorry, within the sablefish fishery was just using a single streamer line, 90% reduction in bird bycatch. With a paired streamer lines, 100% they could get up to. With Pacific cod, it was still equally successful, but not a little bit less so. And that's just because where the cod boats fish, there's a lot more shearwaters, and shearwaters are more proficient divers than albatrosses, and they can get below that 2 meter. It still keeps most of them away, but they can get below that 2 meter depth. So one of the other things that the industry was interested in testing was integrated weight lines. So they did test putting weights on the ground lines, which was effective, but that's also very challenging to do. It's a lot of extra material out on deck, and when the lines are being deployed quickly, there's a safety hazard there too. So they started working with integrated weight lines, and this was very effective, especially for the freezer longline boats, especially for cod, because you don't have to handle the heavier lines like the tub gear, but it was very successful. And so some boats, it wasn't required, but they could use some of the integrated weight longline gear if they wanted to. And so it reduced by itself, without streamer lines, 91% reduction in seabird bycatch, and with paired streamer lines, it was 100% reduction. Okay, and then another big part of this story was getting the word out, right? And not only just the biologists or conservationists talking to the industry, but it was the industry representatives talking to their fellow fishermen. And so there were, was, I think, a huge part of the success in this whole effort. And also fishermen boasting about being able to go an entire season, and for example, with Mark Lunston, and not catching a single seabird. Okay, so fortunately, we have the NOAA Fisheries Observer Program. So there's an amazing amount of data for us to mine to find out just how effective long lines or the streamer lines were. And so in the red, you'll see the albatross bycatch rate per million hooks. And in the blue is the non-albatross bycatch. So you can see that by 2002, when paired streamer lines were used, this is right after the research was completed, paired streamer lines were starting to be used throughout the fishery, and how much seabird reduction there was. And it's important to note that this was not, 2002 and 2003 were strictly voluntary. This was not in the regulations at all yet to use paired streamer lines. And so during this time period, you see there, when they first came into use, we estimated that it saved over 9,400 albatrosses and over 141,000 non-albatrosses just by the industry using the paired streamer lines. Okay, so while Ed and Kim and others were focusing on that work, I was working with Japanese scientists for us to learn more about where short-tailed albatrosses go. And there was very little data other than onboard observations, just opportunistic sightings about the distribution of short-tailed albatrosses. So we started a tracking study where we captured short-tailed albatrosses out in the Aleutian Islands, just baiting them to a fishing boat, capturing them, which wasn't easy, but we did it. Actually, lace sand and black-footed albatrosses are really easy to catch. Short-tails are not. And it's a good thing they're not, because if they were as aggressive at going after baits as lace and albatross, black-footed albatrosses, and fulmars, there'd be a lot more caught by the fishery. So I'm glad they were difficult to catch, but they were pretty shy of coming up to the boats. And then we also captured birds on the colony to look at migration routes and find out how much time they were spent among the different countries of the Pacific Rim and look at overlap with fisheries. Okay, so during that 10-year period, slightly over a decade that we are tracking short-tailed albatrosses, there was quite a trend development electronically in terms of the types of devices we could use. In the very beginning, it was just marginal that we could put a satellite transmitter on a bird and only an albatross. Now we can put them on this very small birds, but at the time we couldn't. So you could see the transmitters got smaller. They also became far more accurate too. So by the time we were working with some of the fledglings, there was the GPS transmitter. So they would take GPS receivers, getting a super accurate location, just like your phone, your car, your boat, and then transmitting that location through the satellites, rather than the satellites trying to triangulate and fix a position of that transmitter. And they got much smaller, you can see there. Okay, so the first thing we identified was that, well, whether we tag these birds in Japan or in Alaska, you can see they spent a lot of time in Alaska during the non-breeding season. During the breeding season, they actually spend most of their time in Japan. But this highlights the importance of us focusing our work in Japan or in Alaska, but also that, there's some issues or some other concerns with the Russian fisheries too, which World Wildlife Fund and the industry did work with Russian fisheries too, which was really exciting to see. Okay, so one thing we did see that they used extensively the continental shelf break and slope region, which is why they overlap the most where the sablefish fishery was, because it just overlaps similar habitat, more so than cod and more so than halibut fishing. But they used the Bering Sea canyons extensively. And here's a picture that was taken where there was at least 100 short-tailed albatrosses around a fishing boat. And you can imagine what that the fisherman on that boat captain probably was wondering, very concerned, I'm sure. But there was no seabird albatrosses taken during these sets with this many birds around them. Okay, I'm going to see if I can show a couple of videos here. Okay, so the one on the left, this is a bird that we tagged, and you can just see the small red line, sorry about that, and the yellow line, the white line. These are birds that we tagged in the Aleutian Islands. The adults and subadults are on the left. And you can see that over about a 3-month period, they stayed very local in the Aleutian Islands and then up to the Bering Sea. Okay, and then here's a juvenile, a less than 1-year-old bird. So this bird left the colony just a couple months before we tagged it. Classic young animal. Whether you're a human, a sea lion, or an albatross, you're just wandering all over the place. Look at that. Couple loops around and down into the Central Pacific, down around the western coast, back up to the Aleutian Islands, just kind of wandering without a particular purpose, that's good, that's fun. That's what we do in our younger years, right? And sometimes when we're older too. Juveniles travel twice the distance per day and much more extensively over the continental shelves. Okay, this is a track of one individual that we had tagged for 5 years. That was the benefit of that solar-powered GPS tag, highly accurate locations. So this bird was at sea for 5 years, never touched land. And this bird was sighted back on the colonies back in Japan eventually. Okay, so as you can see from those previous slides, there were birds spending time on the West Coast. And we know historically there were birds on the West Coast, and there were a few sightings along the US West Coast in Canada. But at the time, in the kind of 2010 around there, there was no requirement to use seabird deterrents in the West Coast fishery. And they were taking maybe about less than 50 albatrosses per year, but they still were taking black-footed albatrosses. And we were just trying to cautiously propose that we should do something about this, because short-tailed albatrosses are increasing. That's good news, but also that means there's more short-tailed albatrosses to interact with the boats. And it happened in 2011. A short-tailed albatross was taken by a longline fishery, a boat along the West Coast, off the coast of Oregon. And that provided the impetus for us to be able to receive some funding to start finding solutions for those fisheries. Okay, so the first thought any rational person would have that, well, some of these boats fish in Alaska too. It's still stable fish, it's still long line. Why don't we just use the same regulations in Alaska down along the West Coast? And that makes perfect sense. But it's also important to obtain that local knowledge and to find out, well, how is there different gear maybe that's being used on the West Coast? So that was our first step, is just go straight to the industry and start finding ways to collaborate with them and ask the right questions. Streamer lines from Alaska were recommended for boats 55 feet and over, and using the Alaska performance standards. But what we wanted to do is to find out, are those sufficient? So our main objective is just to do some research on the vessels, work with the industry, and find out is this going to work for your fishery? Okay, so the first thing we found out, of course, with the first conversation was actually there's two different gear types that are being used along the West Coast. The standard one at the top is what we saw on all the Alaska vessels, which is you just have weights on the ground line. But along the West Coast, and I don't know, maybe some boats use this in Alaska, I'm not sure, but not that we encountered. But on the West Coast, there were boats that were using a combination of floats and weights. So the reason behind that was that some of the areas they were fishing, there was a lot of, they referred to them as hot bottoms. There was a lot of amphipods, sea lice on the bottom that was consuming their baits and consuming the fish. So they wanted to float the hooks and the fish up off the bottom. Okay, so here's a diagram of gear without floats. You can see where this diagram showing where we put time depth recorders on the sinking ground line, so we can find out how far behind the boat the hooks are when you reach 2 meters depth. Okay, so first observation with this research was that indeed with the standard ground line with just weights, the paired streamer lines flown to performance standards for Alaska were sufficient in pushing birds out behind that 2 meter attack zone. Okay, but with the floated longline gear, that wasn't the case. The paired streamer lines using performance standards, links, etc. for Alaska were not sufficient to push the birds far enough back. The floated hook portion of the long line was still within the 2 meter attack zone, beyond the protection of the streamer lines. Okay, so the good news is that large vessels using gear without floats are protected, just like the Alaska vessels were. And many of the vessels were started voluntarily, again, using the bird avoidance. It's a benefit for them, get more baited hooks down to the bottom of the ocean, and then also, I mean, they don't want to catch birds either. The challenge is that large vessels using float gear are not adequately protected. And that also that individual fishing vessel practices make a big difference too. Another part of the analysis, so try to find a solution for those boats with float gear, we looked into the effect of night setting, which has been used in other areas. When Ed Melvin and Kim Dietrich initially did their work in Alaska, part of the problem was that at night, what they were finding is a higher bycatch rate of fulmars. And remember, their objective not to increase catch rates of other species. So for albatrosses, there is a decrease at night. They're not feeding at night. They're not attracted to the lights of the vessels like the fulmars are. Okay, so night setting is a good solution for float gear on the West Coast because there aren't many fulmars on the US West Coast. But it's not such a good solution for areas in Alaska where there's a lot of fulmars. Okay, so more good news though. Population growth of short-tailed albatrosses on Torishima have been increasing. So what bycatch has been occurring is not affecting population growth there. But one of the concerns about Torishima is that it's an active volcano. And this is a picture of Torishima about 2 months after we left Torishima after doing some research tagging birds in 2002. Okay, so what about other albatross colonies? The recovery plan for short-tailed albatrosses is that there have to be 3 colonies that are established, and they need to have, a colony has to have more than 75 breeding pairs, and that it not be volcanically or politically unstable. Torishima obviously is the stronghold, and it's met all its recovery goals, but it's volcanically unstable. The Senkaku Islands is the other area where there's the most short-tailed albatrosses, not nearly as many as Torishima, but we think it's met or close to its recovery objective there, but we cannot go there. Biologists has not been able to visit that colony since 2003, I believe, because it's disputed territory. So the other options are Hawaii. There's on the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, there's short-tailed albatross that occasionally breed there. And then also the Gasawada, the Bonin Islands, there historically were albatrosses breeding there. Okay, am I going to talk a little bit about aerodynamics? This is important for birds in general, but also albatrosses. Okay, low wing loading on the left, hang glider. High wing loading on the right, airplane. An albatross is more like a jet in that they need high wind speeds or high travel speeds in order to stay aloft. Okay, so this is a picture of a composite of average wind speed for the globe. And you'll see that down in the southern hemisphere, the roaring 40s and the furious 50s are the highest wind speeds. And indeed, that's where the majority of the albatrosses nest. And it's also where the majority of albatross species occur. In the North Pacific, we have that small little blue polygon on the left is where short-tailed albatross is, and you see how small that polygon is? That's the foraging range during the breeding season. And over the waved albatross, the Galapagos albatross, the only tropical breeding albatross in this really low wind speed area. And the wing loading is different for all these albatrosses. In the Hawaiian Islands, the Blackfoot and Laysan, that's their stronghold. They have the largest foraging range of any albatross. They're in that lower latitude, kind of mid-latitude, lower productivity zone that they have to travel beyond to get to their feeding areas. So not only wisdom is the oldest bird, it lives in an area where it has to travel the furthest to find food for its young at over 70 years old still. Short-tailed albatross have the highest wing loading of these North Pacific albatrosses. So Hawaii is not a great spot for short-tailed albatrosses. They haven't historically bred there in any number. Also, Midway Atoll is a low-lying atoll. That's what an atoll is, right? So there's concern for sea level rise, but also of storm surges. And for example, here's circled there in red is a short-tailed albatross decoy. They do try to attract short-tailed albatrosses there. But here's the aftermath of the 2011 Tohoku tsunami. And you see that there was short-tailed albatross decoy and one short-tailed albatross chick that actually survived. And there was actually, and then there's a little lace-hand albatross chick sitting next to it. So that's not a great spot to attract albatrosses, at least short-tailed albatrosses too. So that's helped us focus our efforts on starting a new colony in the Bonin Islands, Ogasawara Islands on Mukojima. And this just shows what the operation to translocate short-tailed albatross chicks when they're 1 year old, pack them up at Torishima, put them in boxes, hike them up the cliffs, put them in a helicopter, take them and fly them down to Mukojima. So the goal was 70 chicks over 5 years that we would translocate. And then, but the problem, as I mentioned, as far as the delayed maturation, some birds that will stay at sea for 5 years before coming to shore, we could be hand rearing and releasing birds that then just die. And we don't know the outcome until after the 5 years or when we look 5 to 10 years later. So it was important for us to find out, are these birds surviving once they leave the colony? So we have this unique situation here. We have an experimental and a control group, which we don't always get for some of our observational studies, right? We had the birds that we hand reared or translocated to Mukojima. The crews there hand reared them. And then on Torishima, we had naturally reared birds back at the natal colony. So we attached the solar-powered satellite transmitters, the GPS, really accurate GPS transmitters to look at post-fledging behavior, post-fledging survival, and then also distribution. Okay, so I'm going to show a couple graphs here. Just this is how we determined whether the birds were successful or not, just in the short term, until we saw them back again at the colonies. Okay, so in blue is albatross speed, kilometers per hour. If it's less than 5, the bird's not flying yet. And then on the right is in red, it's the distance from the colony. Okay, so there's the bird on colony. And this is just from the GPS transmitter. This is where it fledged. You see a little bit of speed increase, and it's just still red. The red's low, it's close to the colony. And then these are local movements around Mukojima, and it's still less than 5 kilometers per hour. And then we start seeing sustained flight, right? It's moving farther away from the colony. It's close to 1,000 kilometers away, and it's hitting speeds of, on average, over an hour period of 20 kilometers per hour. So that's survived post-fledging. Okay, here's an example of one that was not successful. So this is a bird actually at Torishima, so a naturally reared bird. On colony, it leaves the colony. So you can see in red, it's moving away from the colony, but it's still hardly any speed at all, right? Now it's back on the beach, and then it's starting to drift away from the colony. The red's up around 20 kilometers away, but the speed is still very low. And so this was a post-fledging mortality. And what we ended up seeing was that about 80% of the birds, so roughly a 20% mortality rate. And there was no difference between hand-reared birds or the naturally reared birds. So within a couple years, we were confident in saying this is working for us. It's a successful effort. Okay. And then this just shows that one bird that left Torishima or Mukojima traveled, and it's less than 6 months, traveled around the North Pacific and was sighted off the west coast of California, which was really cool to get that report and see a picture of our bird. It was really neat. All I guess so much public attention was put on this project in Japan. It was really neat to see all the involvement there. And even though it was not as popular or wasn't as public here in the US, but it was really neat seeing this project get all the attention. And indeed, we were able to, with time, at this publication, we were really excited to show that after 80 years, we finally had short-tailed albatrosses breeding in the Ogasawara Islands. Okay, so to wrap things up, this story started with the fishing industry saying we need help to work with scientists and conservationists and agencies to solve this problem. So they went to Congress, got us a little bit of money, seed money to get us started. We took that money and built all these partnerships and grew what we are capable of doing. We got funding from the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. We got funding from the North Pacific Research Board, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Tokyo Metropolitan Government, and working with a variety of fishing organizations, conservation organizations, scientists, we were able to pull together and make this story a success. I'd like to give some particular shout outs to the Bycatch team that I worked and learned with, especially Ed Melvin and Kim Dietrich, and their initial pioneering efforts and their just strongly collaborative work with all parties involved. And also Troy Guy, and then also Amanda Gladys at Oregon State University, who still works for Oregon Sea Grant and works with the fisheries along the Oregon coast. And yep, thank you very much for this opportunity. And this is such an amazing event that you have here. Thank you. I'm honored to be here. It really reinforces the power of community. And it also enforces to me the importance of us having a connection with our natural environment. So thank you very much.